In just under 2 weeks, the CONCACAF Men's Olympic qualifiers will kick off in Guadalajara, Mexico. 8 different nations' U23 teams will test their mettle against one another for a shot at qualifying for the Tokyo Olympic Games. But only 2 will make it. Will one of them be the US? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. What are the US's chances and what do they have to do in order to qualify? But first off, the teams. So there are 8 teams as stated, but which are the strongest ones? Well, there are only 4 that have qualified for the Olympics before. Mexico has qualified for 5 of the last 7 Olympic Games. That's going all the way back to 1992. And they won gold at the 2012 Games in London. The US, on the other hand, has not qualified since 2008, over 12 years ago. And their best result in the actual Olympics was 4th place back in 2000. Honduras has qualified for 4 of the last 7 Olympics, which is the same as the US, but their qualifications have been much more recent. In fact, they have qualified for every single Olympics since 2008. And their best place in the actual Olympics, also very similar to the US, was 4th place, but again, also most recent in 2016. And then there's Costa Rica. They have only qualified for 1 of the past 7 Olympic Games, and that was back in 2004. Next, the format of the tournament. So the 8 teams are split in 2 groups. Group A with Mexico, USA, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic, and Group B, which has Honduras, Canada, El Salvador, and Haiti. In each group, the different teams will play each other once. So that means each team will have 3 matches to play where they can earn points. A win is worth 3 points, a draw or tie is worth 1 point, and a loss is worth no points. After all the matches are played, the top 2 teams in each group will be the ones that advance to the next round. Now, most of you already know this, but I decided to explain it for anyone who maybe is entirely new to the sport and the tournament format. So now, what does this mean for the US? What do they have to do in order to secure enough points in order to make it to the next round? Well, let's see. So the US, as stated, are in Group A with the other favorites of the tournament, Mexico. Now, I do think that the US should be considered favorites along with Mexico to qualify, and I personally expect both to qualify. So, in fact, having Mexico in the same group actually really helps the US. How so? Well, remember, the US doesn't have to top the group in order to advance, they just has to at least make it to that second spot. And there are several different scenarios on how this can go. Let's go over them. Scenario 1, also known as the best case scenario. Now, 6 points should be enough to make that second spot. So that means they need to win at least 2 of their 3 games. So for the first match against Costa Rica, in this scenario, the US wins. It won't be easy, obviously, because Costa Rica is no slouch, but the US should have more than enough quality to get a win here, giving the US 3 points. The next match is against the Dominican Republic, which is their debut in this type of tournament. No reason for the US not to win. Should be a comfortable win for them, which should give them 6 points, and now should be enough to progress into the next round. Now, this is important that they have 6 points from these 2 games because the next match they're going to play against is Mexico. This will be the toughest game of the group for the US. But in this scenario, this game actually really doesn't mean much because by this point, both the US and Mexico will have already garnered enough points to qualify for the next round. So this game would only determine who finishes first and who finishes second, which can be important for the next stage, which we'll explain in a moment. But for now, for this game, as this is the best case scenario, let's say the US managed to win it or maybe draw, but end up with having a greater goal difference. So either way, the US finishes top of the group. And that is really the best case scenario for how this can go about. Scenario 2, which I guess I'd call the okay scenario. So now in this scenario, the US draws against Costa Rica in the first match. So that means they only get 1 point along with Costa Rica, who'd also get 1 point. And now because of this, the next game against the Dominican Republic would be an absolute must win. But apart from that, they would also now require that Mexico also beat Costa Rica in their game. That's the difference with this scenario, is that the US's fate wouldn't necessarily be in its own hands. It would require the help of other teams, namely Mexico, to beat the other teams as well. And if that happens, in this scenario, that way the US would now have 4 points, the 1 point from the Costa Rica game and the 3 points from the Dominican Republic game. And now that would leave Costa Rica, now thanks to Mexico, staying with only 1 point for now. And now for the toughest match against Mexico. Now, instead of it just being a nothing game, now it definitely means something. And the US would have to get some points from this. They would need to at least get a draw. Because that way, even if Costa Rica beats the Dominican Republic, which would be likely, they would get 4 points. But now, if the US manages to draw Mexico in its third game, it would now have 5 points. So they would be the ones to advance to the next round, being in that number two. Now, the last scenario, the worst case scenario. Here, the US loses its first match to Costa Rica, but hopefully not by much, only by like 1 goal. And Mexico will need to beat the Dominican Republic by at least 2-0 in its first game. So the US would still be ahead of the Dominican Republic on goal difference, despite both losing their games. In this scenario, goal difference plays a big role, as we will see. So now, after this game, the US is in third place. Not very good. The next game against the Dominican Republic not only becomes an absolute must win, but now the US must win by a good amount, like at least 3-0. And not only that, but they would also depend on Mexico beating Costa Rica by an even bigger margin, like at least 4-0. Because that would allow the US to not only hop over Costa Rica, but would also leave Costa Rica with a bad goal difference. And that's going to factor in for the last match. Now against Mexico. The US would go into this match with desperation and uncertainty. Coaches and fans alike would be keeping an eye on the result of the Costa Rica versus Dominican Republic game. The US would want to at least get a point from this game, but as this is the worst case scenario, let's say they don't even get that. They lose, but they don't lose by much, only 1 goal. So let's say 2-1. So that leaves the US with just 3 points, but with a goal difference that is still positive. And so, in order for that to be enough, they would need the Costa Rica game to go their way. So, they would need the Dominican Republic to beat Costa Rica. Not very likely, but this would be the only way in this scenario that the US makes it through. And Dominican Republic doesn't necessarily need to beat Costa Rica by a lot. They just enough so that they still have a bad goal difference. Let's say 1-0. Now, that would give the Dominican Republic 3 points as well. But more importantly, it would keep Costa Rica at just 3 points. So now both would still have a negative goal difference, and that is the only way the US would still advance in this scenario, purely on goal difference. That's why it's the worst case scenario. So those are the three different scenarios on how the US can move on from the group stage to the next round. Which will be the one that ends up playing out? Honestly, a lot is based on how that first game against Costa Rica goes. If we win, great. If we tie, okay, not the end of the world. But if we lose, then it's time to start worrying. Now, before we go into the knockout round and what that would look like for the US, just a quick reminder to please go ahead and press that like button if you are enjoying the video so far, and consider subscribing for more content. All right, on to the knockout round and the semifinals. So the way that will be set up is that the winners of Group B, which I think will most likely be Honduras, will play against the runners-up of Group A, which is also most likely, hopefully, the US. And the winners of Group A, Mexico, most surely, would play against whoever is the runner-up of Group B, which can be either one of the last three, Canada, El Salvador, or Haiti. I honestly can't decide which would be able, or which is most likely to progress. So just for purposes of this bracket, I'm just going to put Canada there, just as a placeholder. I'm not saying that I think they will make it. Again, just using them as a placeholder for this example. So in this case, the semifinal for the US is Honduras. And again, that's most likely who they're going to end up playing against. And honestly, this would be the toughest game of the tournament. And this would be the one that determines if the US qualifies for the Olympics or not. Because remember, the top two teams of the entire tournament are the ones that are going to qualify. So the US doesn't necessarily need to even win the final. They just need to make it to the final, meaning beating this game, the semifinal, and that's it. They're in. Now that is easier said than done. As I stated, Honduras will be tough. If their recent U23 games are anything to go by, which was back in the 2019 Pan American Games, where they managed to beat Jamaica, tied with Peru, and even managed to beat Mexico 4-2 on penalties in the semifinal. They only lost to Uruguay and then Argentina in the final. Now, I'm not sure how much the team has changed since, how many players might have aged out or that won't be in the current squad, but The point being is that historically and recently, Honduras has done well. Remember, they have qualified for every Olympic Games since 2008. That being said, I still think the US has a strong chance of making it through. If they do, then they will meet Mexico, most likely, in the final. Now, as great as that sounds, having US play Mexico in a final, but in the end, this game won't end up meaning much because by this point, both teams would have already qualified for the Olympics, which is what the whole point of this tournament was. So this would be just for pride and bragging rights. That said, I think this final would mean more for Mexico than for the US. Mexico would be under a lot of pressure to win, especially because it's in their own home. If they lost, it would be a huge embarrassment, not only because it was in Mexico, but it was to the US.
What is happening around here today? Are gringos falling from the sky?
So most likely they will play their best players of the tournament. Whereas with the US, I think it would actually be wise to rest some of their best players. The ones that have done well and impressed in the tournament, ones that maybe have earned a spot in the actual Olympic team or even the senior team because of it. Why risk injuring these players for a game that is ultimately just a glorified friendly? It would be foolish, in my opinion. Better to give some game time to the other players who maybe hadn't had a chance to play up until this point. Because, like I said, Mexico is going to do everything they can to win this game no matter what. But the point is, win or lose, the US will have already qualified for the tournament. And at the end of the day, that is all that matters. So, guys, that is how the US can qualify for the Olympics. It is literally just 3 games to glory. It's Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and whoever it is in the semifinal, most likely Honduras. That's it. Come on. Can the US do it? Of course they can. So much is already going our way. The group we're in, the order of the teams we play, the fact that the only times we will have to face Mexico, easily the strongest team in the tournament, are in inconsequential games. Honestly, it is much harder for the US not to qualify than it is to actually qualify. All right, guys, now it's your turn. How are you expecting the US to do? And are you going into this tournament hopeful or cautiously optimistic? Let me know down below. And thanks for watching. This is American Soccer United, the place where American soccer fans unite.